Hey, it's Matt from Black Coal Woodworking. Today I'm making a salt bowl with a scoop. Started out by milling up some 6-inch wide pine. I did both sides through the planer and cut it square, and I glued two pieces together because I want to make this thicker. A pro tip my wife gave me: when you're doing a glue up on your island, use wax paper under it. It makes it so much easier for cleanup. I sketched out all the different ideas I had for this bowl, and these are the ones that I came up with. You'll see which one I chose. After the glue was dry, I had to drill the hole out for the screw chuck. You ever run into those situations where you just can't get the right depth with your wood on the drill press and you just use whatever's at hand to try and get that right size? Well, that was this piece. Over at the lathe, I mounted that little block of wood on the screw chuck and started turning it round. I'm using a 1/2-inch bowl gouge to do this. You will notice that I'm wearing gloves to make this bowl, and I usually do. It's actually very common. As long as you keep your hands behind the tool rest, you'll be just fine. There is a line in the middle of this bowl blank, I'll call it, that I'm trying to get rid of, and a thicker part of it, in fact. I got rid of most of it, so it's pretty seamless, although you can obviously tell that it's two pieces of wood glued together, but I'll deal with that in a little bit here. Found a very creative way to do that. Alright, now I know what I've got to work with, so I'm going to start to shape the outside of the bowl. Now that I had the main overall shape, I used kind of a pull scrape to get the final shape kind of fine-tuned. Worked out pretty good. And then I started to create my foot. So I'm going to grab it with a 4-jaw chuck using a foot like this. I'm also trying to mark out where the tailstock can sit. That way I can reattach it to the lathe later, putting that tailstock in exactly the right spot so that I can turn that foot off. And here I'm actually pressing that mark into the bottom of the bowl so that I know exactly where that goes. So the bottom of this bowl is going to get a charcoal stain. So I'm going to try that. So I have my smashed up ash, I have walnut oil. I have never tried this with walnut oil before. So we're going to do a little experiment. So I have a couple of options when it comes to turning the outside of a bowl black. One is to actually light it on fire and just burn it black, but I find that when I do that, it dries the wood out so much that it warps more than I want. So another option for me is to take burnt wood like this, crush it, and use an oil to help get that color to penetrate deep into the wood. I tried here to spin it on and that did not work. It just sort of took too much off. So I reapplied all that ash and oil, and then I made sure to make this bowl completely dry before I moved on to the next step. And the next step that you'll see here right away is just simply putting wax on it so that it no longer comes off. So this is now putting on the wax. This wax happens to be a mixture of walnut oil and beeswax. That's 1 part beeswax to 4 parts walnut oil. Because it was dry, I could apply it and spin the lathe like this to kind of buff that wax in and get it to sort of dry to make sure that there's no residue coming off anymore. Now, I tested it on my hand, didn't come off at all. It didn't stay as dark as I was hoping exactly, but it did alright. Did much better than my first attempt. No idea. This is either brilliant or just gonna look silly. So my main problem with this was that I obviously glued up 2 pieces to make this bowl deeper, but that glue line was just so obvious that it turns out this little solution was bordering on the brilliance as far as brilliance go with this. So that hid that glue line quite well. Even though you can still see it, it's way better. I guess it's one of those times where if you highlight a problem, it suddenly looks like the solution too. I love hollowing out bowls, but this, not so much. Right there, that caused something to, I don't know, snap, something. So I had to reseat the bowl in the lathe and could continue. That seems to be something that happens to me fairly regularly whenever I have a hole drilled in the center like this. It just seems to be so much harder to stay on the lathe. So anyway, once I got past that point and, realized that it was scary but not that bad, it just feels more scary at the time because you wonder if it's going to fly off at you. So I am leaving the walls a little thicker here, and that's so I can add a bit of a ledge on the top rim of the bowl for the lid to sit in. And it's nicer to have it a bit thicker because after that ledge is in there, then it's gonna look like a thinner bowl. So to smooth out the bottom of this bowl, I switched over to a round nose scraper. Otherwise, I mostly use the 1/2" bowl gouge. The tool I'm using to make this little edge is a diamond point scraper. The wax on the inside of the bowl is the same kind that's on the outside, which is that walnut oil and beeswax. Now for the lid, kind of the same start, just a bit of a thinner piece of wood. 1/2" bowl gouge again, just to make it round and to do some shaping. Once it's round, I mark out where I want the knob for the handle. Using that mark I made, I use my 1/2" bowl gouge to trim the outside top of that lid to reveal the handle. I like to flip over to that diamond point scraper again just to fine tune the knob. Helps me shape it, and it's really kind of a nice tool for that. To get into the corners though, I did switch over to a spindle gouge, just a little guy. I don't even know how big that one is. I always measure the outside of the bowl and transfer that mark to the lid. That way I know how big this lid should be. I really want to get it a fairly tight fit right now, only because when I do the inside of the bowl, it's kind of got a friction fit like a jam chuck into the inside of the bowl. I'm not always that successful with it, so sometimes, like this case, I'm going to use an alternative method to make it stay. I use the diamond point tool again to kind of straighten out the sides of this lid, and I'm lining up the sides of that diamond point tool with the rails on the lathe so that I can tell when I'm straight. And once I've got that straightened out, I flip back to the bowl gouge to give the top of the lid that shape that I want. It's going to have a nice curve to it, and I use kind of a pull scrape to get it to kind of give the shape I want. I get a nice fine shaving so I know it's doing a good cut. And then I also transfer the depth of the recess I cut on the bowl for the lid. That way I know how deep that lid's going to seat inside the bowl, and I can keep carving the lid down to about that line. I had a lot of really big plans for these little decorative lines. They ended up being a whole lot more work than I wanted them to be, mostly because all of my plans failed. I tried so hard to get those things to burn, but I just didn't have the right kind of wood to get that to happen. I tried screwdrivers, bigger pieces of wood, toothpicks like you just saw there. Finally, I just recut them to cut out most, if not all, of that burnt wood, and just leave it as a very plain decorative line. Add some wax and oil again, and just call it done. So as I alluded to, the way that I attached this lid to the inside of the bowl is with tape. The jam chuck part of it did not work so well, probably just because of the curve of the lid on top, so I just used a plethora of tape to get this thing to work. So when I put the lid in the right way, it's actually a little bit too tight, so I went back to the diamond point tool to expand the recess in the bowl a little bit, and then the lid fits a little bit better. Here it's still actually way too tight again, so a couple of times later it was actually, could say a little too loose, but you really don't want to have it tight at all when you're in the kitchen. And you just want to pull the lid off and not have to worry about the bowl coming with it or spilling everything in it. That's not fun either. After that's all done, I flipped the bowl around and stuck it back on the lathe with the tailstock holding it in place. I do have one of those kitchen rubber foamy things to help the inside of the bowl stay clean and not marked. And I used a bowl gouge and a spindle gouge to kind of work my way through the bottom of that foot and to shape it the way I wanted. All that was left was to cut off that little kind of nub that I used for the tailstock and sand it clean after that. So I just used my knife and had a lot of fun actually cutting that part off. Alright, moving on to the scoop. It's going to be roughly a 1.5 inch by 1.5 inch square, and I started with my skew chisel just to bring it closer to round. I like doing it this way because it's fun, and then I flipped over to its side and used the skew chisel that way. To hollow out this thing, I went to my spindle gouge. It's just a really small one, the same one I was using before. And I found that if I poked into the middle and then just kind of pulled out to the side like that, it worked quite well, and I could really get an even wall thickness all the way down as I'm hollowing this scoop out. I'm not going to show much of it because not even I could see inside of it, so we'll kind of skip to the outside here. Had to make it a little more round still, had a couple of flat spots, and then it's really just about shaping the outside of this scoop. This probably looks like the most awkward thing ever, but I am trying to come up with a little ball at the end to make it easier to hang on to. Just the method I use to get there probably isn't the best one, so if you have a better way, try that. But I'm just sort of working my way down as I go, getting it thin enough, and then eventually cutting this thing off. Couldn't catch it though, but thankfully I have a nice bed of shavings underneath the lathe to get that thing. And you'll notice there's a crack in it. And I knew that right from the start, and my intent was always to use the sander to shave away the part with a crack, because it wouldn't matter anyway. It didn't go as far along as I thought. Pause for puppy break. 2 cows and a panther. After the puppies were done, and I sanded or filed a hole, that way the scoop could sit in there nicely. And here we go, it's the final product. Thanks for watching. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, share it, and if you haven't already, please consider subscribing if I've earned it. Thanks so much.